Aloha, everyone. This is Tasha with Ellie Live Action on the beautiful island of Maui, and you are listening to T.W. Smith at Kung Fu Podcast, where you explore the culture, adventure, and impact martial arts has. So turn off that TV and turn up your speakers.
Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about. And I'm your host, T.W. Smith. I am so glad that you allow me to be part of your martial arts journey. You're in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. Folks that put in a great deal of sweat, a great deal of effort to honing their craft. Today, we're going to be taking a few moments to recognize one of the pioneers in Chinese martial studies and martial arts in general, Mr. Brian Kennedy. He has been described from leaders in the field of Chinese martial studies as being kind, honest, and down to earth. Mr. Kennedy made tremendous contributions to understanding the martial arts in general, and particularly the Chinese martial arts. He lived from 1958 to just recently passing away in September of 2019. Mr. Kennedy worked as a criminal law professor in Taiwan. Nearly 20 years ago, during 2000 to 2003, he was already working articles in the Dragon Times publication. His martial arts journey began in 1976, and during the time, he studied boxing, wrestling, then along with Tai Chi, Bakwa, Xingyi, and other styles. Mr. Kennedy also studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with Andy Wong in Taiwan and had just recently earned his first stripe on his brown belt at the age of 61. He said, quote, "I first grew interested in martial arts history back in the Bruce Lee, Kwai Chang Caine days. My parents got me a copy of Robert Smith's Asian Martial Arts, and one of my high school history teachers let me do a semester of independent study on Chinese martial arts history. That independent student project back in 1975 got me started on a lifelong interest in Chinese martial arts history. The field of Chinese martial arts history has progressed so much in those 40 years, but many of the same challenges remain," end quote. Agent of Action of Kung Fu Podcast, Professor Ben Jucken writes, he was also, quote, "a historian and cultural translator of the traditional Chinese martial arts." He continues, "Trained in law, he had a fine analytical mind and a razor-sharp sense of discernment when it came to evaluating the many newly discovered manuscripts that began to emerge in the 2000s. His extended residence in Taiwan gave him an opportunity to study both the history and the practice of a variety of Chinese martial arts at a critical point in time," end quote. Two of the must-reads, if you're a martial arts practitioner or interested in a grounded understanding of some of the history, is to read Brian Kennedy's work, along with his wife Elizabeth, on the Chinese Martial Arts Training Manuals, a historical survey that was written in 2005, and then Jingwu, The School That Transformed Kungfu, published in 2010. Ben described his work as, quote, "His writings clearly conveyed the methodological understanding that verifiable, credible sources on the activities of historical figures were proper subjects of historical writing," end quote. Something that his law training probably contributed to as well. Mr. Kennedy tackled topics early on in his writing career. For example, a focused technical comparison of Jack Dempsey's writings on boxing and comparing that to Xingyi. Now, these early writings had a stirring effect on many people. Now, I've read many of the articles going back during that time. I will share parts of articles as we go along, and I can tell you that Mr. Kennedy's work stirred passionate responses. And whatever position you may have taken with some of his work, you were going to have to come with much more than, "Well, my sensei told me," or "my sifu said." Mr. Kennedy was going to stimulate much deeper thought than that, and your arguments had better come with some meat on the bone. Here's an example of an article that references Mr. Kennedy 10 years ago for stimulating further thought in this writer's work. It was titled, "Grabbing at Dynamite, punching outside of the karate box. It begins with a quote, "I can't sing and I can't dance, but I can lick any SOB in the house." That was by Mr. Jack Dempsey. The author at TKRI blog wrote, "This essay grew out of notes of an unfinished review of Jack Dempsey's 1950 book, Championship Fighting, Explosive Punching and Aggressive Defense, along with personal notes that developed over the course of a year on intensive work of punching." The author writes, quote, "What does a black belt know about punching?" I first read about Jack Dempsey in an article written by Brian Kennedy and Elizabeth Goh for Classical Fighting Arts in 2006. This article, entitled Jack Dempsey, Master of Xingyi Quan, focused on a boxing manual written by the 1919 heavyweight world boxing champion. As I began the article, I wondered what an old-school Western boxer had to do with an Asian martial art, or karate training in general. I was still in the karate is superior to boxing because it uses the whole body phase of thinking that some people go through early on in their training, and some never leave to their detriment. The book in question, Championship Fighting, Explosive Punching and Aggressive Defense, written in 1950, seemed quaint and outdated, right down to the rolled-up sleeves and the pompadours in the accompanying illustration. By the end of the article, however, my interest was piqued, and suddenly my dichotomous conceptions of boxing and karate began to mutate some. The utter clarity of Dempsey's cited examples set off a new train of thinking. Regardless of styles or arts, punching is punching. Using the fist to damage or knock another person out is a skill that is governed by the same principles, regardless of where that art develops. To borrow a phrase from Harry Cook, we all practice the 2 hands, 2 feet, 1 head fight of styling, end quote. So Mr. Kennedy's work had impact on other people's work who were also writing. Mr. Kennedy also did a biographical analysis of Sun Lutang, which we've featured here on the program. In fact, I think it was 3 or 4 episodes. Once again, his approach is simple, clear, and well supported. But one of the early works of Mr. Kennedy's that really got my attention is from the summer of 2011. It is in the Electronic Journal of Martial Arts and Sciences, to which there is a publication titled The Journal of Alternative Perspectives on the Martial Arts and Sciences. I made a post on our social media accounts where I was sitting down one early morning after I had done a little bit of my exercise, and I was doing my last review of this. And the title of Mr. Kennedy's article in the journal is Chinese Boxing Classics in Translation, Problems and Peril. The abstract reads, "The quality that makes a good essay in one language, culture, or time may not be the same qualities that make an equally good essay in another language, culture, or time. The reason is that the cultural, aesthetic, and literary criteria can change. This essay provides an introduction to this issue." Now, during this one essay, Mr. Kennedy takes a massive broad stroke at the often overlooked issue of translation. He wrote, quote, "When attempting to translate Chinese boxing classics or training manuals from their original Chinese into English, that core problem is exacerbated by a number of factors. Even if you never intend to translate an article yourself, when you're reading or listening to the translation, then this will help you understand why it sounds disjointed." Now, I had discussed this problem in reverse when we had the episode on Christianity Meets Martial Arts podcast, when the Catholic Church representatives were trying to translate their Italian, Greek, or English text in a Christian context into not just a language, but into a culture. The problems that they were having on both sides, I mean, nobody agreed with what they were coming up with. Gives you an idea how difficult sometimes translating concepts can be. What is really incredible about this article, though, is that it represents much of Mr. Kennedy's style and commitment, is that he didn't just write about a problem, in this case, translating Asian martial arts manuals. He discussed the impact that these problems were going to have. He discussed factors that contributed to the problem, such as the sentence structure of English essays versus Chinese essays, But he also brought into light some other overlooked areas. For example, a single translation of a martial arts book may bring a publishing company only several $1,000s. Not a profit, but just overall. Oftentimes covering just the expenses to print and distribute a martial arts manual is barely covered. And if you're a publishing company and you know that going in, how much are you willing to spend to get a really good translation? Now, Mr. Kennedy made a metaphor. He said, if you're looking to make money doing that, you might as well be flipping burgers. Even further, Mr. Kennedy walks you through in detail what he believes at the time you needed to address that problem. I say at the time because 10 years later, he revisits the article and adds nuances that he had not added before. I remember once Agent of Action Professor Paul Bowman discussing that history is supposed to change. We learn things later that we didn't know before. We gather new perspectives. And history, as we know it, is a working document. Mr. Brian Kennedy contributed much to the working knowledge, and he laid a stage for new research that will change things as we go along. And in my mind, that's extraordinary. He had an interest in Taiwanese Taoism and was apparently planning a book on Taoist training manuals. I'm not sure if that'll come out or not, or maybe even just excerpts from it. And the other thing that was really interesting is just on a personal side, not just his academic training side, is that people would seek him out, as you might imagine, to ask him who they should train with in the Taiwan area or any other surrounding areas. And Mr. Kennedy would not soft shoe it at all. There were only a few Chinese martial art instructors in the Taiwan area that he believed could practically apply their art. Those and those only would be his references. Mr. Kennedy also became a conduit for other researchers. Mr. Ben Junkin said, Andrew Morse's 2004 academic volume, Motto of the Nation, A History of Sport and Physical Culture in Republic China, which has been referenced here at Kung Fu Podcast several times, was an echo of Kennedy and Go's work. Yet, his book, Mr. Morse's book, is largely inaccessible, even to me. To those who do not frequent university libraries, that's a pretty hard book to get. First of all, because it's only available in hardcover, and it sells for anywhere from $55 to $110, even on eBay. This example, the Motto of the Nation book, speaks to what Mr. Kennedy had mentioned before about the cost of good translations and well-written texts. Many times they take the path of being an academic book, which makes it a lot more expensive and harder to get by. Also complicating this book, Motto of the Nation, it is written in standard academic style. And I can tell you from somebody who does this pretty regularly that tackling academic written books is tough. Sometimes it takes me several hours to transform a few pages into something that I can understand and embrace and perhaps even be able to share a little bit later. Andrew Morse came to benefit from Mr. Kennedy's work and his ability to mediate between the two spheres. Ben says, quote, the Chinese and the Western, the past and the present, the rigorously historical and the often fantastic, end quote. We have lost a pioneer in the research of Chinese martial arts studies and in martial arts in general, a dedicated historian and a defender of traditional martial arts. Every researcher and author that I read in the preparation of this podcast wrote virtually the same things. Brian Kennedy was kind, generous, and is going to be sorely missed by a huge martial arts family. If you have studied his contributions, it is time well spent. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode, where I wanted to recognize the passing of a pioneer. Take care, train hard, because Mr. Kennedy would be training today if he was still here with us, and I will be talking with you real soon.